Yep, recording in progress. Jolly good. I'm Caroline Dudley, President of the CES, and I'm going to be sharing the chair this evening with Felicity McDowell, who's going to represent the Prehistoric Society. Felicity is the Evaluation Officer for the Oxford University Gardens, Libraries and Museums Department, which is called OxyGLAM, which is really good. And she's based at the Museum of Natural History in Oxford. I'm going to start things off, and Felicity will chair the questions and answers at the end. So please remember that we ask you to write your questions in the chat box, and Felicity will relay them to our speaker, Dr. Matt Knight. Now, let me introduce Dr. Knight to you. Matt is a senior curator of prehistory at the National Museum of Scotland, specialising in the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age collections. His particular fascination is with Bronze Age metalwork and its treatment and deposition. His PhD, which he completed in 2018 at Exeter University, focused on metalwork from southwest Britain, and he's published widely on Bronze Age metalwork, including an updated corpus of Bronze Age metalwork from the southwest in collaboration with Susan Pearce and Teresa Ormrod in 2015. He's recently published a reworked version of his PhD entitled Fragments of the Bronze Age. Under the circumstances, it will come as no surprise to you to hear that Matt's topic tonight is the destruction and deposition of metalwork in Bronze Age Britain. Matt, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you very much, Caroline, for that introduction, and thank you to you all for attending tonight. It's always a pleasure to speak to the Cornwall Archaeological Society, and an even greater pleasure to be speaking at the joint lecture with the Prehistoric Society. Tonight, I'm going to speak to you partly about my PhD research, which focused on the destruction and deposition of metalwork in southwest Britain, but I'm also going to speak more broadly on the topic and explore some of the implications of doing a case study, focusing on a case study region for examining wider narratives around this phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that's particularly fascinating. It includes the deliberate breakage, bending, burning of a whole range of objects from the earliest aspects of the Bronze Age in Britain, right the way through to the transition into the Iron Age. What you see are swords that have been, apologies, I think there's something wrong with my sound. Let me just stop sharing for a moment. Right. Sorry about that. I hope that that is now a little bit better. What we see is we see swords that have been bent and broken and twisted and burnt and thrown into watery places, axes that have been smashed up and piled in hoards, daggers which are burnt and placed in burials, ornaments that are contorted. And this phenomenon you see at various points in time and manifest in different ways, and it extends beyond southwest Britain, and you see it across northwestern Europe and indeed further east as well. And what it represents is this broad ideology that where people felt it was appropriate to bury objects in the ground, and there seems to have been a particular focus on metalwork, and that's what I'll talk about tonight, but it does extend to a whole range of material culture. And traditionally, there's been a focus on complete objects, particularly why would you deposit a complete sword or a complete bronze neck ring, for instance. And the destruction aspects have been often considered to be the result of scrapping processes or deliberately broken in order to recast certain objects. And the focus on why, I think, has directed our attention away from the rather interesting aspect, which I think is how. How were these things being treated and how were they being deposited? We may speculate that some of these may be ritual offerings. We may speculate that they are founders' hoards or the stashes of metal workers. But unfortunately, when we're dealing with prehistory, these sorts of questions the answers are always going to elude us. We're never going to know why. And I think by switching our focus to looking at how deposits were made, how objects were treated, how they were placed in the ground, we can start to recognize aspects of technical skill involved in deposits, broader ideologies that are at play, as well as some of the structures that governed depositional practice. My own research has focused on exploring some of these avenues through experimental archaeology, where I've made replicas and tested different ways of breaking objects in order to understand the materiality of the objects, as well as some of the processes and skills involved. So here you see comparisons between my replicas, which are the blacker objects, and archaeological artifacts, which are the greener objects. And this, these qualities of breakage that I've been able to replicate are replicated when you heat bronze to a certain temperature, about 500 or 600 degrees, and then you strike it with a blunt object, and it forms this nice fragmentation that we see across Bronze Age Europe. And when you don't heat the bronze first, you get examples like this, which fail, and you don't achieve the fragmentation that is desired. And I'm not going to talk about my experimental work today. I've spoken about that in the past, indeed to this society, but it's these sorts of elements of skill and material knowledge that I wish to draw upon as I take you through a series of case studies that allow us to construct a narrative of what was happening in terms of Bronze Age metalwork deposition in Britain at this time. And I want to begin by looking at objects and their treatment when buried with the dead. At the turn of at the conventional turn of the end of the Neolithic into the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, around 2400 BC, we see a shift in burial practices towards inhumations of unburnt skeletons. These were deposited in kists or under barrows, and often associated with a range of material culture. And this might include bronze daggers, beaker, pots, stone axes, and a variety of ornaments, not to mention rare examples where organics survive, which show us just how much else might have been buried with the dead. And at around 2000 BC, perhaps a little bit earlier, there's a steady shift towards the cremation rite, the burning of a body and reducing it in order to bury cremated remains. And you see these two practices, inhuming people and also cremating people, happening side by side. But what you also see when cremation rites start to take over is evidence of burning associated with objects appearing at the same time. So what you see on your screen here are 5 daggers from Cornwall, Devon, Dorset and Somerset, which each show some elements of burning. It's a particularly difficult thing to pick up on bronze because bronze as a material doesn't burn, but what does char and burn and leave evidence on the dagger is the organics coupled with corrosion products. And these show signs of warping, as well as some deformation and some cracking in some instances. And these show the most conclusive evidence of having been burnt. And in addition to this, there's about 6 others from Southwest Britain. And this hasn't been looked at properly from across the rest of the from across the rest of Britain, but other examples are noted elsewhere. And what's intriguing is that in almost every single instance, they are associated with cremated remains, which suggests we're looking at a parallel treatment of the objects that are being buried with the dead and the treatment of the dead, which allows us to start to unravel some of these questions that always circulate grave goods. The questions often are these the possessions of the dead? Are these gifts from mourners? How do we interpret what is a gift and what is a possession? And I wonder if the treatment of objects in the same way as a person allows us to start to view some of these links where let's say these daggers belong to the deceased, it's appropriate to burn the dagger with them on the pyre. We can take this a little bit further when we consider some of the examples that have other grave goods that haven't received this treatment. So for instance, this dagger here that you see second in from the left is from a grave at Woolmead in Somerset. It shows signs of having been stabbed into something, signs of use, cracking, a little bit of burning evidence. But it was deposited with an intact pin of quite a rare type, as well as a complete accessory cup and a pendant. And there's a juxtaposition here between objects that have not seen extensive use and destruction and an object that has. And these were all buried with cremated remains, and we might speculate that the dagger that was burnt with the pyre is something associated with the deceased, and the objects that have not seen similar treatment are perhaps gifts placed into the grave afterwards, and certainly not burnt with the dead. It's a bit more complicated than that, though, because we also see signs of dismantling. We see signs where people are not deposited complete. Particularly in Devon and Cornwall, we often find remains of cremated remains that don't represent a whole person, and they're in fact partial deposits. And this is also reflected in the treatment of objects. So this dagger that you see on the left here from Angros in Mullion shows extensive signs of burning. It seems to have been complete when it was deposited with cremated remains, but it was deposited with fragments of a biconical urn, incomplete, and also the cremated remains were not the full extent that we might expect from a cremated individual. And so we might speculate that they are depositing fragments of people and fragments of other material culture. I focused here on daggers, but in fact, this extends much beyond daggers and extends to other materials. When we think of daggers buried with people in the early Bronze Age, it's often considered to be quite a widespread thing, but there are specific areas where we see more daggers being buried with people or more closely associated with people than in other areas. So areas like Wessex, Yorkshire, parts of Eastern Scotland, these are areas where dagger blades are comparatively quite common to be buried in barrows with the dead. However, we have other areas where dagger blades are less common, and instead what you have are partial other pieces of daggers. So here you have a burnt pommel deposited with cremation at Beth Bramwyn in Anglesey, and here again another pommel buried with a double cremation at Beech Hill House in Perth and Kinross. And this again suggests that element of dismantling that I mentioned. The blade itself hasn't been deposited, but a pommel that was once attached to a dagger has been taken off and included. And again, this extends to other objects. Beth Bramwyn is a particularly good example because we have these collections of jet and amber beads, bits of bone toggle, and they all seem to derive from probably more than one necklace, and certainly don't seem to represent a complete necklace. And this is something we see elsewhere as well, where we have composite necklaces that are made up of freshly made beads and worn and more worn beads from multiple necklaces. So we have this whole process of dismantling and putting things back together in different ways as part of the burial practice. And some of this might relate to heirlooms, some of it might relate to processes where you're keeping remnants of objects in circulation, and it's only appropriate symbolically deposit parts of objects in lieu of the whole, which might be what's happening with the pommels. But it speaks for it speaks to the very intricate construction of the grave and burial rites at this time, which is shouldn't be a surprise. Our own funeral practices are very individualized, and so what you have are broader ideas being applied in very localized ways, is depending on what is appropriate in any given area. And I'll come back to that point again later on in my talk. Connecting the treatment of objects with the treatment of individuals is something that we can explore quite easily in the earlier period of the Bronze Age, because we often have material culture in quite close association with people. Over time, certainly metalwork deposition seems to be something that takes place almost exclusively within the settled landscape, and very rarely with people. And so we have to look at other elements that tell us, what do these deposits mean? So for instance, here on your screen, we have the Priddy hoard from Somerset. It's a collection of 17 finished and unfinished torques, as in neck rings, bracelets, and other coils of wire. This was found by a metal detectorist, described as crushed into a ball in the ground. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of that, but it's since been disentangled. And this is a very curious action where, because of the malleability of gold, it's possible for someone to have compressed all these things into a tight-knit bundle and place it in the ground and sacrifice this ball of gold in a seemingly random act of decommissioning. Steve Minnett and Naomi Payne have done a survey of the area around and have written up this hoard. There appears to be no other activity in the immediate area, apart from the deposition of 2 bronze powstave axes, which may or may not be related in some way, but it seems to have been deliberately segregated from any other form of settlement activity. The interpretation of this find was the deposit of an individual, but I wonder, with this many ornaments, whether it's a much more communal act, coordinated as part of a broader scheme. But it does make us wonder, why is this gold being placed in the ground? And for this, we need to explore what else is happening with gold objects at this time. So we're going to enter a very shiny part of my talk where we're going to see lots of pretty gold objects. The closest comparison in terms of treatment of objects to Priddy is this bundle of ribbon torques from Heop in Paris, where you have 3 intact ribbon torques that have been bundled together into a ball. This is them as they were found in 1955 and is perhaps the closest example we might have to what the Priddy hoard might have looked like when it was deposited. Again, it's an unusual crushing and deformation of otherwise usable ornaments. We see forms of deformation and fragmentation taking place in a variety of forms at this time. Here we have a selection of a hoard of about 38 objects from Poulton near Cirencester, and whilst you've got a couple of complete rings that you see here at the center, you've got a variety of different types of torques, bracelets, gold bars that all have been hammered and cut and chiseled and all very deliberately broken down. And this has been interpreted as the wares of a goldsmith or a metal worker, fragments of bits of different pieces of object that were intended for recycling and gathering together, and then they were placed in the ground for collecting and use later. this is often the interpretation applied when we find single fragments of various ornaments from this time. The portable antiquity scheme and the increased popularity of metal detecting has been invaluable for bringing lots of these things to the fore, whereas we might previously have focused on hoards. We now have such a wealth of single finds that all show these signs of decommissioning that we can start to explore whether indeed these are actually lost fragments, as has previously been suggested, or indeed they are part of some other wider scheme. And in some cases, they do highlight that we may not be too far off the mark when we think about their role as in terms of recycling. Here we have 3 torque fragments from Ancaster in Lincolnshire that have been found melted together before they ended up in the ground. More commonly, what we see are complete torques that, or historically what we've seen is more commonly is complete torques that have been placed into certain areas. We have a very large example recently found from East Cambridgeshire weighing 700 to 800 grams. It's a massive torque and condensed collection of material. And on your right here, you've got the Minch torque serendipitously found while scallop dredging off the in the Minch in the Western Isles. And these are interpreted when they're found, partly because they're complete and partly because of the areas they're found in, they're interpreted as special offerings. And it's usually their complete nature that's considered to be that special, that allows us to recognize that more specialized aspect. But even with the complete ones, weird things sometimes happen. So here we have a complete twisted neck torque that's been coiled up, and it's been deposited alongside a series of really fine pieces of gold work. These are really intricately made objects. Some of them are incredibly rare, certainly for this time. And unlike the other deposits I've shown you so far, they were deposited alongside a series of bronze axes. We get a sense of why this one might have been coiled, because here you have the fragment of the base of a ceramic vessel, and it's been suggested that these objects may have once all been deposited in a ceramic vessel, and the coiling may have served a functional, a semi-functional aspect, because it was placed in, it allowed it to fit within the vessel for deposition. We see coiling happening elsewhere, where indeed a single finds. In the top right, you have a bar twisted torque from Yeovil, another one from Cambridgeshire. And this has been interpreted in 2 ways. This has been interpreted as reusing the torque, perhaps rather than for wearing around the neck, but for wearing around the arm instead, or it is in itself a form of decommissioning. But it's a very different type of destruction to cutting it into pieces, because in this sense, this destruction is potentially reversible. You could uncoil it. You could reuse it in as in a variety of ways. And I should stress, this isn't exclusive to Britain. This is observed in other parts of Europe, France and Ireland. And I always like to include this example from Northern Ireland, because when it was found, it was originally interpreted as a spring for a classic car, and it was only later recognized for what it actually was, as an ancient gold object. So we seem to have a tension here between what might be considered the wares of a metal worker or intended for recycling, and what might be a sacrificial offering. And I would argue that we need to see these as very integrated processes. There's no reason it has to be one or the other. And this is quite nicely exemplified by this hoard of finished and unfinished torques and bracelets from Towdnack in Cornwall. And what you have around this at the center here is a complete bar torque, and another one here at the bottom. and a collection of finished and unfinished bar bracelets at various stages in the gold working process. But you can see here how intricately made some of these talks are. Found by themselves, we might interpret them as a votive offering. However, these talks and the gold within this, when weighed, fit within a graded weight system. The smallest ones are around 30 grams, the medium-sized ones are around 60 grams, and the largest ones are 90 grams. So we've got 30, 60, 90. And that suggests that there is some aspect of gold working knowledge going into this deposit. We also will struggle to reconcile the really nice complete objects with the unfinished ones. And this is also what we see in the Priddy hoard. The hoard from Cornwall can add another interesting element when we consider how it was deposited, because you had all the smaller ones nested inside the larger ones, a form of nesting these objects. And so we see different, I think what we're seeing are different forms of structuring a deposition when some of these things are collected together. So crushing a ball of talks together, as you see at Priddy, might be just a manifestation of the same practice of nesting these objects together, as you see here at Towardneck. And I think one of the reasons we struggle with understanding gold depositions such as these, particularly where they're heavily fragmented or deformed in some way, is because to our modern perceptions, the value of gold is such that we can't understand why you would put it in the ground. And I think what we need to conceptualize is that the purposes behind deposition, whatever reason they are being placed in the ground, outweighs the material value of these objects. And this is something that David Fontaine from Leiden University has argued, not just for gold objects, but for a variety of bronze depositions that we see across Europe. And I think that's a really interesting point, that these don't necessarily need to form within a functionalist ideology. We just need to know that they made sense as deposits in the Bronze Age. Moving away from the shiny gold things, I want to take you into the later Bronze Age period, the turn of the first millennium BC, and particularly focus on a phenomenon where we see the gathering and mass destruction of weapons, particularly swords and spears, buried in wet places. And this is something we see across Britain. I'll focus here on a hoard from Duddingston Lock from Edinburgh. This is a collection of about 45 to 50 pieces of weapons, and these were placed in this lovely lock that you see on the left here at the foot of the rather dramatic volcanic outcrop of Arthur's Seat in central Edinburgh. And to give you a better sense of what we're looking at, here is a selection of some of the material. You can see that lots of it has been snapped in half, lots of it has been bent. Under closer inspection, many of these objects are warped, they've got bubbled surfaces, they're twisted, they're melted in places. What this suggests is that this material has been gathered up in either one process or multiple processes and exposed to really, really high temperatures. Bronze melts at around 1100 degrees Celsius. And so to cause the warping and bubbling of the surface of bronze, you need to be getting it pretty close to that. A standard cremation pyre can actually reach those sorts of temperatures. And so if you're piling weapons onto a pyre, we can start to conceptualize quite a dramatic event of burning of all these weapons. And it's been suggested by Tobias Mutz of Berlin University that these are sacrifices of martial equipment, that perhaps the wares of an enemy that have been gathered together and sacrificed so that they cannot be used in a hypothetical afterlife, or indeed by anyone else. Alternatively, I do wonder if this is a control mechanism of what's in circulation, whether or not this is a way of removing weapons and reducing the potential of conflict. But Duddingston Lock gets even more interesting because the account of recovery, which is remarkably good considering it was found in 1778, the account of recovery notes that it was recovered while dredging from the shell marl at the bottom of Duddingston Lock, about 100 yards from the shore, which means that what we're dealing with is actually a really interesting example where destruction and deposition, we can clearly see that they are two separate events, even if they are interlinked in terms of their motivations. To gather all this stuff together, burn it, that's one event, that's one spectacle. But then to load it onto a logboat, a canoe, some sort of water vehicle, and take it out towards the lock and deposit it overboard, that speaks of a second coordinated practice that was part of removing these objects from circulation. They could indeed never be recovered from the depths of Duddingston Lock. This is actually something that we see happening across Britain at this time. We see it at a very scaled level. Sometimes, for instance, in various rivers such as the Thames, we see individual spears and swords that have been snapped in half and thrown in, a practice that grows over time. But in other areas, we see hordes of objects being treated in very similar ways, broken into lots of different pieces, snapped in half, exposed to high temperatures, and buried in a variety of watery locations. The Bloody Pool hoard from Devon, buried in a marshy location on Dartmoor, or the Tattershall hoard from Lincolnshire, buried at the point of a tidal inlet. And this speaks of an ideology that seems to have interlinked the locations in which objects were being deposited and the treatment of the objects themselves. So in order to make these things appropriate to go into water, you needed to cause them intentional damage, and usually through the exposure to high temperatures and then fragmentation. This relationship becomes even more striking when we return to Duddingston Lock and look at what's being deposited in the landscape around it. Here on the right, we have the remains of a large collection of swords that were deposited in a dryland location, and although bits of them are incomplete, they certainly haven't suffered the same extent of damage that we see from the Duddingston Lock assemblage, and indeed from Arthur's Seat itself, overlooking Duddingston Lock, we see the deposition of two intact swords, almost directly juxtaposing the treatment in the same material across two different areas, Arthur's Seat being a high dry place and Duddingston Lock a low wet place. The collection of weapons during that particular period of the Bronze Age, that 1100 to 900 BC, raises the interesting aspect of selection. What was being selected for fragmentation? What was being selected for gathering to be buried in certain places? So with the final aspect of my talk, what I want to talk about is some of these selection processes and some of the more regionalized trends that we see right at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1000 to 800 BC, and the way that these things occur in a variety of locations. Here we have the Wick Park Sturgsey hoard from Somerset, the largest hoard from southwest Britain. Here on the screen, all you see is a selection of axes, swords, spears, fragments of casting waste, and in total there's 146 fragments from this hoard. This hoard is quite curious in terms of its composition of axes. These things are usually considered to be scrap hoards, random accumulations. It's been suggested that they are the abandonment of bronze at a very particular time, perhaps the collapse of the bronze industry, although as I hope I've shown, the fact that fragmentation and deformation seems to span the Bronze Age, I think means that what we're looking at instead is a very intense period of fragmenting objects prior to deposition. And we can speculate that there are indeed some selective aspects in terms of constructing these hoards when we look particularly at axe heads that are found in the Wick Park Sturgsey hoard. An analysis of which portions of axe were found in this hoard shows that the cutting edge, that is this blade at the bottom, there's a minimum of 22 axe heads represented, and a further 24 are complete or mostly complete. And this is contrasted with about 20 axe heads represented by body or socket mouth fragments. This may, on the face of it, sound like a fairly even split. You've got 20 cutting edges, about 20 cutting edges, about 20 complete axe heads, and about 20 socket mouths. But the experimental work that I've done shows that when you fragment a socketed axe, what you get is a thick chunk of the cutting edge, and then the body and socket mouth tends to fragment into some of these really tiny pieces, but also some more substantial chunks, anything up to 5 to 10. And what this means is that actually 20 fragments of socket mouth doesn't actually add up to that many axes, whereas 22 cutting edges must represent at least 22 axes. And this is something that's actually been observed across a variety of hoards in Britain, where in Britain and indeed further in Europe, and the work of some continental scholars has shown that there's a disproportionate amount of sword hilts in some hoards. There's disproportionate amounts of axes. This led me on to an interesting idea about whether or not we might see the same sorts of proportions of objects being buried as single finds. The problem with single finds when they come up is they often come up without context, and we're often left to speculate about whether or not they are casual loss or whether they actually mean anything at all. So I wondered whether we see the same disproportionate amounts of objects, object pieces, elements showing up. And what I found when I analysed single finds of socketed axe heads from southwest Britain is an overwhelming amount of cutting edge fragments showing signs of deliberate damage, very few body and socket mouth fragments, and then a proportion of mostly complete undamaged axes. So we may speculate again that there is some sort of special nature attributed to the cutting edge of an axe that makes it appropriate for deposition. And I furthered this by comparing where these things crop up across southwest Britain, and I also looked at swords and blade fragments as well, and compared that with where we have collections of hoards. And what I found was that axe heads and portions of axe heads tend to show up in the same sorts of places that hoards containing axe head fragments are also cropping up. They also crop up in similar locations that you might expect other depositions along river valleys and in some high places. This is something that could be taken further, but I think it starts to hint at a scaled practice to deposition, where single finds may represent similar practices to what you see in hoards. And we're actually quite wrong to be making a distinction between single finds and hoarded finds. And this is something that's been discussed by Katerina Becker for the finds from Ireland as well. Returning to the Sturgsey hoard, one interesting aspect of this is that what we see is a collection of objects that speak of more regionalized traditions being assembled in a single location. And I won't go into this in too much depth, but of the axes that are diagnostic, what we see are elements of Welsh axes, axes from as far as Yorkshire, and indeed from central and eastern England. And the character of the Sturgsey hoard actually matches what's happening in South Wales, and we may speculate that this is in fact a South Welsh ideology that's crossed the Bristol Channel and has manifested itself in a deposition in the lowlands of Somerset. Regional trends such as these, or rather the character of hoards that suggest regional trends, is quite interesting for allowing us to look at how different regions might have been connected through the treatment of objects. What you've got on the left here is a map of late Bronze Age miscellaneous sword fragments that broadly show the extent of what's called the carp's tongue tradition. This is a cross-channel tradition where hundreds, if not thousands, of objects were gathered together and fragmented and buried, particularly concentrated around southeastern England and in northwestern and Atlantic France. And you see here on the right, one of the largest hoards from Kent, from Bourton Malby. And these highly fragmented hoards in these areas have tended to dictate how we think about late Bronze Age hoards more broadly. These very, very fragmentary objects and these very, very fragmentary hoards are taken as a given as part of a widespread practice that's happening at this time. By looking at some of the elements of these hoards that suggest continental affinities, or rather cross-channel affinities, and also in the extensive treatment, we can start to pick up where we're getting hints of this practice elsewhere. And here, this particularly fragmentary hoard from St. Michael's Mount, very famous site off the south coast of Cornwall, that I no doubt many of you will be familiar with, shows elements that are very reminiscent of what's happening in northwestern France and southeastern England at this time. And through metal detecting, we have a combination, a variety of such finds, not quite as large as St. Michael's Mount, but slowly cropping up, that have pieces of traditionally carp's tongue material showing up. And indeed, we have this also showing up in southwest Wales, in Pembrokeshire. And so what we seem to have is a tradition of collecting particular types of material, fragmenting it in particular ways, happening in southeastern and northwestern, southeastern England and northwestern France, but actually evidence that it's cropping across the channel, particularly in western Cornwall and even into southwest Wales, whereas we don't have very much evidence at all of this tradition anywhere else in the southwestern peninsula. I mentioned that this narrative of those highly fragmentary hoards has tended to encourage us to describe all hoards from the late Bronze Age as very fragmentary, sometimes scrap hoards. And I think actually what we should be seeing as is a very regionalized tradition that's happening. The character of the objects rather speaks of interconnected ideologies instead of the mass abandonment or the mass recycling of material at this time. And this regionality is emphasized when we look at other parts of Britain and other parts of Europe to see what is happening with the hoards there. The further north you go in Britain, the fewer highly fragmentary hoards that you encounter. So you can see here, in comparison with hoards of highly fragmented axes that you see in southeastern England, you've actually got hoards of complete intact axes showing varying signs of use and varying signs of treatment. And at a broader level, you can extend this to look at areas where fragmentation is far more common or not. So in southeast England and northwest France, I've already stated, highly fragmented objects. Northern Britain, less so. In Ireland and the Netherlands, you see very few highly fragmented hoards being deposited, whereas in Portugal, you see more fragmented hoards being deposited. And so destruction becomes part of a choice of how you treat objects and an expression of how different areas are connected and what ideals are held to be particularly important. And that's not to say that fragmentation doesn't occur in all of these regions. It's just that it occurs to a lesser extent, which suggests something different is happening within this shared ideology of deposition. And even to rein this back in and back towards Southwest Britain, even within an area such as this, we see variations in depositional practices happening with regards to hoarding. So I've mentioned that we have this collection of fragmentary hoards cropping up in Cornwall that show affinities with across the Channel. We have another cluster of hoards that show up in South Devon that are highly dominated by fragmented ingots. Compared to these, the destruction of the Bloody Pool deposition hoard on Dartmoor stands in contrast. And as we go further east, hoards deposited in Dorset and in Somerset show very little unified very few unified characteristics. This hoard from Dorset shows more affinities further east than it does west. And in Somerset, there's 5 hoards deposited of 5 very different characteristics. There's nothing else like the Sturgsey hoard buried in Somerset, and this can be contrasted with a deposit of gold bracelets in a settlement at Breen Down. And this focus on hoard deposition also ignores the gaps that we see in this region. If you look here in North Devon and Eastern Cornwall, you have almost no hoards deposited whatsoever. And this is a trend that's long been recognised. Susan Pearce recognised this, and it was speculated that it might be a symptom of recovery. But with the increased metal detecting that's happening, we're still not finding these hoards. So we're looking at a genuine regional variations in terms of what was deposited, how and when, within a relatively small area. And so this, I hope, shows that whilst we can look at these broad narratives in terms of depositional practices, focusing in on some of the localized elements actually shows diversity and regionalization in some of these practices. So to bring this talk to something of a close, hopefully what I've emphasized is that this is a very diverse practice. It spans the Bronze Age to varying degrees, and the reasons for destroying metalwork and then depositing it are highly varied. In some cases, it seems to have been intricately linked with burying the dead. In other cases, it's linked with the landscape, or it's linked with an idea of the value of certain objects. Where we see, where we can analyze exactly how things were broken or deformed or burned or twisted, it often indicates aspects of technical knowledge and indeed elements of performance that changes how we can recognize what might have actually been quite a significant action. And whilst broad patterns in terms of deposition highlight that at various times there was a widespread adoption of what should be deposited where, but this also allows us to see how these things transform over time. And this is a crucial element that I want to end on. Destruction and deposition of metalwork is a very particular thing happening in particular times and spaces. These are situated practices that are part of broader Bronze Age ideologies, but we mustn't forget that they're undertaken by people in reaction to specific events within the lives of people and within what is available to them at the time. So it's no wonder that we see such variation in terms of what's being deposited where. But when we delve into some of these localized practices and work our way up, we can see how these similarities and differences allow us insights into what's happening in Bronze Age society in relation to metalwork and how they're creating depositions that are very meaningful to them at that time. And I want to end my talk by shamelessly plugging my book on this topic, which was released last week and explores many of the ideas that I have spoken to you about tonight. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for listening and acknowledge a wide range of people, but particularly Cornwall Archaeological Society and Prehistoric Society for inviting me. And indeed, Cornwall Archaeological Society have provided funds at various points over the last few years in support of my research, and I cannot be more grateful for that. And it's a pleasure to share the results of my research with you tonight. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. And Cornwall Archaeological Society's contribution to your work was money well spent, obviously. Can I now hand over to Felicity to handle the questions?
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, we now have some time for questions. So if you have any questions